Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. One of the things that I find incredibly valuable in relating to people or experiences is when I can get to closure. And I know this about myself, so I have to actually watch myself that I don't try to force something to closure, because when something is sort of messed up and messy and in process, it can be the wrong time to force it to closure. You know, the forcing it to closure can create an ending in a relationship that would have worked out fine in the fullness of time with a shift or a change or an adjustment. And so I'm very mindful of that. But the relationships where I've had the hardest time getting over someone, comparatively, so similar amount of intimacy and connection and liking of them, if we sat down and had a respectful conversation that we were parting ways, that's not such a big deal to me. I don't like it. There's some grief, it can be hard. But that clarity of, yes, we have decided together, this is the thing that we're doing, is really helpful. Whereas when I've had people who end relationship by ghosting, by which I mean not just that they don't text you, but they don't text you back when you reach out and then they never initiate again, I know there's a lot of that, and I know that someone listening may have even done that, and I really get it. I get that there's I would argue, emotional maturity, so, I could have compassion for people who don't do that. I'm not going to say that they're perhaps as healthy or as aligned with what works for me about what we kind of owe each other for treating each other well. And of course, if there's a safety issue, so if you're a woman and you're uncertain of a man's response, that might make it really hard to, be displeasing. And I'm not adverse to, at least telling someone initially via email, just for the opportunity for that to get absorbed, especially if you're available to have a conversation afterwards. But without going into horrible people do this, I know it costs me a lot more emotionally if that is a way that I don't have the opportunity to be treated by the other person. If the other person doesn't have the value on, saying, wow, we've had this experience together, it's not working for me, it's come to an end, let's honoringly step out of connection. And I also really get, why people choose not to do that, because, sometimes there isn't a level of emotional responsibility. So, there are people who sometimes say, oh, I want people to be direct with me, or I want people to tell me the truth. But when someone does cough up the truth, or someone is direct, the pushback and the explosion and the anger and the reactivity is so intense that it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I cultivate being a safe person to break up with, being kind and respectful even amid sadness and disappointment, and we thought it was going to go another way. So there's a lot here, but one of the things that I don't know that in 21 years of working with people I ever haven't needed to do some work on someone's behalf is around being complete with the past. And I think that having a society that chronically gets excited about beginnings but doesn't really engage with endings, with all the complicated aspects of that, is something that creates a lot of energy leaks and a lot of ways that our energy is really tied to the past. So of necessity, as someone who chooses to be involved in online dating, I do my best to have discernment about whether someone and I are on the same page about how we would end if that became relevant, which is unfortunately on a first date more likely to be an outcome than, that we will have a happy, successful, sustainable relationship forever. So I can use my discernment, but there's no guarantee that someone will treat me in the way that I want to be treated at the point that they decide that they're no longer wanting to go forward. And there are places that I make these kind of choices in my own life where I may be really direct with someone, but I don't want to do the unpaid emotional labor of processing with them. I had a would-be client a little while back who was just doing a lot of boundary pushing. She really wanted a free consult. She really, really wanted to talk to me on the phone about her situation. I said, that's great. I totally honor that. Book a session. I'm happy to have a conversation with you, but I want to be paid for my time. I book 100% of my sessions most of the time. So I'm just choosing to focus my time on people who know they're a yes, not on people who are a maybe. If you need to know more about me, read many, many things I've published, listen to my podcast, lots of ways to know me more. But if you want to talk before you book, just book a session. I'm happy to make time for that, but I'm not going to take time out of my schedule to gift you. I'm so sorry. And I explained all the background and a lot of what I've just shared here. And so she kept trying to do in-runs. Well, I'm going to book, but then why don't we just talk for 15 minutes? Why don't we just do this? And in the end, after, several boundary pushing, not listening to the information that I shared, I just said, I'm sorry, I'm canceling your session. I'm not going to work with you. And then she gets on the phone and leaves me a voice message. I don't understand. If you could just call me. And I'm like, that's been the whole thing. There were other factors as well. I'm not giving all the details, but the upshot is I'm really sensitive to people who are boundary pushers. And full disclosure, I have been that person when I was caught up in something. I remember a generous but awkward conversation when I was in college. I'd gotten involved with an environmental advocacy organization, and as someone who wasn't dating, I'd ended up being the chair of this organization, and a lot of that was trying to get students to sign petitions and donate money and get involved in things. And there were phone calls to other students who'd given us their information that they were interested to try to get them involved, and kind of nudging and nagging people in a consensual way to try to get them involved. But I took it too far. So I had been told by the professional organizer, hey, we need to get people to do this. So I called someone who was involved and she said, no, I can't do it. And I kept pushing, no, we really need this, because I was on the mission with this authority figure to get the person to do the thing. And her roommate came back later and said, Katie, you're not taking no for an answer. I'm like, yes, I am. I wouldn't do that. And she said, I was there in the room. She told you 3 times. I'm like, oh. And it was really beautiful. Like I haven't stayed in touch with the woman that I knew back in college, but the emotional intelligence to just in a really neutral way reflect back, these are the facts and this is what you were doing. She wasn't judging me. She was just really holding up a mirror. And I genuinely had no idea that I was doing that, although when presented with the evidence, it was quite obvious I was. So it's not that I don't realize that good people can be these boundary pushers when they just get caught up in really passionately wanting something. We see that. I have neighbor dogs that come visit me and, training them not to jump on me, and their excitement of you're a person and we get to interact now, that there's a beauty to that enthusiasm and desire. But if you're so filled with something, an agenda or a desire or an outcome that you're really excited about, that you're not hearing the input of the other person, that's gonna cause some problems. And my willingness to have somebody I decided not to work with and go through and explain that to her just wasn't there. So I'm not saying anything really hard and fast like, oh, you owe it to people to explain your no. And this willingness to complete something that you're done with in a clear, clean kind of way, I think is just a really important aspect. So when I work with people, very often with their former romantic relationships, there are all these cords and connections and energetic structures that are derelict. I'm getting soul parts back from their previous partner. And granted, the energetic training of how to cut cords and acknowledge each other and step out of each other's fields and stop running energy together isn't something we get trained in. I wish we did. I think it would be so incredibly useful. But given how few people are willing to just even have a direct conversation, from an intimate relationship where they say, I'm complete with this. I need to step away. And the amount of lack of skill around that, it might not even be helpful if people did have the wisdom and the information. And I'm using the example of romantic relationships because I think we can relate, but I've done sessions where somebody retired after 30 years of teaching, and I was coaxing their energy and their magic out of the school system that they'd been so immersed in. They'd really given their time and attention and energy and wanting the outcomes and being part of that team. And then they were retired. They weren't going there anymore, but they didn't know how to acknowledge it and gently draw their magic out. And having a cake, congratulations on your retirement, it doesn't have that completion, process necessarily. And so a lot of times in the modern world, we do need to work with the energetics on our own, create rituals, have meaning, and be willing to sit with some of the crunchy emotions to allow them to move through in their season. So one of the really interesting parts of my journey, I created a healing space pretty early on in my professional offering of shamanism. Even though I still had my engineering job that was what was making me money, I rented this healing space and put beautiful fabric on the ceiling and brought in couches because I wanted people to be really comfortable. And I started doing soul retrieval and teaching classes there. And I, filled it with crystals and intentional items. And I did all this deep work to have it be a dedicated healing space. A lot of people do work out of their living room and see clients there, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I really wanted the integrity of a container that was only used for this particular, really specific intention. And so as a result, having this for years and years and years, there were so many layers of magic and intention and, support from the guides. It was, for an energetically sensitive person, it was palpable when they came in off the area outside that was next to a busy street into this energetic sanctuary that was this sacred space. And I built it and I maintained it, and I was the guardian and the caretaker, even as I shared it with other people. So over time, my business just became more and more over the phone. The San Diego market's really saturated. There were students that I trained who had started their own practices, which was super cool. A lot of people at that time were coming to me because they read my book. I had somebody from New York who said, I knew I had to work with you because people from two different social circles who had no connection to each other both mentioned your name. I'm like, wow, that's wild. So just organically, I was doing less and less with the healing space. And then the gal who was sharing it with me, who actually was taking up more of the time, she got pregnant. And so she was like, okay, I'm going to be on maternity leave. I'm going to have to step out of the space at this point. And I just didn't have anyone else stepping forward, which turned out to be incredibly elegant because I gave notice months ahead of time that the end of March 2020 would be the end of my tenancy in this office space. And COVID wasn't even on the radar when these decisions were made, but it ended up being really elegant because just as we were going into lockdown, where I wouldn't have been able to see people in person anyway while we were figuring out how we were going to navigate all of this, I had the transition in process already. And I love my life now. I live out in the hills of San Diego, and I have all these beautiful big windows, and it's just a really sweet way to offer the work over the phone. So it's been a really good transition for my business, for my lifestyle. Living in the hills of San Diego meant that it was a longer drive to the healing space. So very elegant. But I also had this deep relationship, and I went through this process of giving things away and taking things down and deciding what I was keeping and selling off the crystal inventory that I had, and kind of saying goodbye and very, very gently taking down this incredibly organized energetic structure that just had lived its duration, and it was a very odd thing to know that I was done when the space that I'd been so devoted to and spent so much time in just felt like a neutral office space. By the time everything was out, it looked like a neutral office space, and it was just a really complicated journey because I was in really deep with it, but very clean, very, very clean to draw my energy out. And I think that a lot of times, because we don't know how to deal with the grief or the sadness or the awkwardness or someone else being disappointed, there wasn't anyone stepping forward to pay the rent, but lots of people were really sad to see this space go away that they'd been a part of, so there can be a lot of emotions that aren't bliss, joy, happiness. But I would argue that fully drawing our energy out of what we've been involved in and letting the grief and the sadness and the fear of the future and the kind of take apart move through, and being able to breathe through that and be with it and let it have its season frees us up for so much more, bringing our energy into the next experience. So I remember years ago I'd ended with a relationship, and grief is my biggest shadow emotion. I do not like to feel grief. Tired is the other one, but the less healthy side of me will take tired over sad, So a lot of times I'm really, really tired, but actually I'm masking sad, and it takes a lot of energy to numb emotions. But I'd had a breakup. I went through some of the emotions, and then like 6 months later, I was just still really sad. I didn't want the guy back. I was super clear that, we were not a good match. But there was this grief of the dream that I could have this version of partnership that turned out not to be what was on the table. And I remember thinking, darn it, if I just sat my butt down and not just taken off the top layers of the grief, but really let this move, it wouldn't still have its teeth in me 6 months later. I could just be done. And so I've gotten more disciplined about not just bleeding off the really acute emotion, but really making space for the deeper layers to move, because grief moves through, and if you let it actually can move through pretty darn quickly, especially if you don't have a lot of emotional debt of years and years and years of unprocessed grief. If you're just grieving the event of the moment, it has a lot of ability to move through very, very dynamically. But if you're knee-jerk, anytime I feel grief, I numb it, you get that emotional debt, and then you get really swamped with it when you have one of those major life events like the loss of a pet or a loss of a loved one, or a friendship that comes to an end, or a romantic relationship that comes to an end. And one of the things that I notice is I still have a little bit of oddness about some really significant relationships that were in my 20s. There were two women quite a bit older than I was who were very gracious and very loving friends. And part of the friendship was they kind of let me follow them around like a puppy. So, I would call them up and ask to come over or have dinner, and they were graciously happy for that to happen. And then as I got a little older and my life diversified and things sort of changed, I stopped initiating so much. And I'm not somebody by any measure who, is like, they have to prove they love me by initiating at least as much. Like, I absolutely don't have that story. I have beloved friends who I only get to see because I initiate, and then they say yes, but they're just bad initiators. It's no reflection on how much they love me. It's just that I'm not always a good initiator. So I definitely don't want to have the story like, if people love you, they'll initiate. I think initiating and how you initiate and how often you initiate is just a quality and or skill of an individual relating to the world. And there's a lot of power in being the initiator. You get to pick in some ways what people do if you have the idea. So I'm not saying like, this was terrible, but I'd had an emotional shift and I stopped initiating so much, and then they didn't initiate for a really long time. And I mean like a couple of years when I say a really long time. And the relationship faded away as a result. And I just didn't feel magnetized to it in the way that I had me kind of chasing these people and trying to make engagement happen. And I think they, it had run its course for their side too. The richness kind of wasn't there in the same way. And so, as a result, they kind of drifted away. But it's a strange thing not to have ever really had a conversation. I've had some conversations over the years, but to not have really cleanly stepped out of such an important, significant relationship, there's still this feeling of like, that feels odd to me. And on the flip side, as I speak, I have a relationship where the person just hasn't reached out in way too long, and so I'm not going to try to date him anymore. But what I know about him is a little bit of emotional immaturity. And I'm like, I'd like to have a closure conversation where I was like, hey, I really enjoyed you. Thanks so much. Let's, acknowledge that we spent some time together and I wish you well in your life. But my sort of inner knowing about him is if not enough time passes, it's like if you have kids and you realize there are all these toys that they're not playing with and everything's really cluttered. So you try to gather some toys to, go give away to a thrift store so they can, move on in the world. And suddenly it's their favorite toy. They haven't touched it in 2 years, but now they're devastated at the idea of this thing going away. So very thoughtfully and as an exception, I'm using the fade away approach with this particular person because I think if I had a closure conversation, it might activate, some part of him. No, I was just really busy when, I think his deeper truth is shown well through his actions. But I just want to invite you to think about this. This applies to graduating from a college, if that was part of your path, or leaving a job. You've been with these people all this time and suddenly you're like, hey, this is weird. Never see you anymore. Off I go. Maybe we'll keep in touch. Maybe we won't. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm a really big fan of choosing again and being able to move into the next thing. I just think people give up so much of their life force energy by all of these open doors that never got properly closed and completed that become places where energy can leak. And there's that completion, like having the skill to end clearly seems like a really important thing. I know that with the guy that I, recently went on the date with and told, I'm so sorry. I've enjoyed your company, but I just don't see us going forward. I had the ability to just look him in the eye and say that really clearly and then make space for any way that he wanted to respond. And it wasn't the most pleasant, but I kind of had the ability to hold space for myself that it wasn't unattainable. I think for some people, they make a choice, there's a certain, well, I don't want to see the person anymore. There's nothing in it for me. I don't need to do this. And for other people, there's just the lack of emotional regulation where the trigger, the emotional numbing they're doing makes it really unattainable to sit with even a little bit more discomfort. So they're, dodging and avoiding. But it still felt weird, even with the clear spoken out loud. It was a first date, but it had taken us a while to get time on the books, and he'd been texting me daily, which was flattering. He was making it clear that he was super interested, even though we weren't getting together. And to go from, interacting very, very briefly on a daily basis to we're never going to interact again, there was sort of this like, whew, let me just let the energy reorient. It was a small thing. It didn't take like 3 days, but there was just a movement of the shift and the change. And as you become more adept and aware of your energy, you can facilitate this. And so I'm a huge fan of shamanic journeying for gently cutting cords, for clearing energetic structures. I would caution you that it's not going to do you any favors to try to do an end run around the emotional processing by cutting cords before you're ready to do so. It hasn't happened in a while, but I have so much compassion for the people who have a soulmate who's a terrible human partner for them. They're completely misaligned. What would make their nervous system happy and allow them to really thrive in a relationship is not what's on the table with this person for a variety of reasons. It could be that, one of the people doesn't want monogamy and the other person, monogamy is really the right thing for them, truly the right thing for them. Or there could be an addiction problem, or there could be an anger management problem, and it's so hard when there's deep love and deep soul connection and something that just absolutely really is a deal breaker, and no amount of therapy or working around or conversations or discussions is going to make this really be a successful place for you to do life, being that close to that person. And sometimes I get clients who they're still in the thick of it. They're still breaking up and getting back together and having fights and, trying to withdraw their love to get the person to come after them, and they want to cut cords. I'm like, well, I'm happy to cut cords for you, but, I'm still really hearing a part of you that is going to throw more cords right back. I had one relationship that was really hard, and I would diligently cut cords all day, and then I'd send him more cords in the dream time because I wasn't done until I was done. And I have a lot of ways that we could speed up being done through working with things. But just know that if you're trying to use a skill like energetic facilitation of completion and withdrawal to get out of a certain emotional processing of an ending, that's going to trip you up in some different ways. One of my dearest friends just had the really hard thing where, she lived in a house for 6 years. It was a rental. The property got sold, and the new owners have a different vision for it. They're, giving everybody the 60-day notice with 1 month rent free, and then they're going to fix up the units. They're going to demolish this, somewhat falling down house. There's a lot of termite damage, and build something else. And, and it's a version of flipping a property that's a little harder on people than flipping a house, because these are rental units. So, she's put a lot of time into the garden, and she's found a place she's even happier with, that she thinks is going to be even more needs met for her. But there's still the tears and the sadness and the grief of drawing her energy out of the earth, coming out of relationship to the garden that she's created and the experiences that she's had there. And she's doing an amazing job, but there's just a knowing that an amazing job doesn't look like not crying, like not having tears of grief, like not having waves of profound loss as she shifts her life over. So it's all these things running in parallel: excitement about the new place, energy moving, new possibilities opening up, and deep loss. And both are true at the same time. So you can always do this retroactively if you were like overwhelmed at the time and you just need to pull out a journal and just look at, maybe what you didn't process. As someone who does online dating, it has been necessary for me to learn the skill of getting to closure if someone that I've been intimate with isn't willing to just have an honoring conversation that says, hey, I enjoyed your company. This didn't work out. So sorry, we're parting ways. That directness makes a massive difference for me in how quickly I recover. But I have learned to do it myself. It's lovely when someone does that, and I try to work with people who are good with that, because it's expensive if they aren't. But there's a learnable skill where you can go through all of the emotion, even if the person ghosts you, even if they just disconnect, and it really doesn't feel good. Like I'm annoyed with them for much, much, much longer than I would be, and that's mine to work through. There are no guarantees of really anything when you explore a new relationship, but I just want to offer how much less energy it costs and how much less of an energy leak if we go through all the complicated emotions and complete and draw our energy out and make it a ritual and make it a process. There's an increasing demand for facilitators who can help with what's called conscious uncoupling. And it's basically what happens when there's a couple that have shared a lot of life, they're parting ways, and they want to do it in a way that's really kind and honoring and doesn't leave, their beloved of so many years bleeding and doesn't leave them bleeding, but they really, really, really need to not have their life all interconnected. And I think that's really beautiful, and I think it's beautiful that they're facilitators, and certainly that's part of the work that I can do for people, whether it's relationship, whether it's drawing your energy out of a job, a project, a friendship, a place that you were living. There are definitely ways that I, as a shamanic practitioner, can help you to regather your energy so you carry it forward with you rather than leaving pieces of it stuck in places because you never went through the process of saying goodbye. It's a little bit of a different kind of thing, but I remember having a conversation with the guides in Death Valley a number of years ago, and as I went through my late 20s and into my 30s, the question of whether motherhood would be part of my path was one that really walked with me. There were times I really felt called to it. There were times when it didn't feel like such a good match. Who I was dating at the time and how successful we were being certainly factored into whether a baby felt like a good idea. I think hormones also did as well. But I didn't have the experience. I think that there's a beauty to it when women are either completely clear that this is something they want or completely clear it's something they don't want. And I think for a lot of women it's 40-60 or 30-70. You know, there's a part that's a yes and a part that's a no, and you know, there's only one outcome. You know, either you have a baby or you don't. So, you know, getting those parts aligned is its own journey. And I know there are people who really want babies and struggle with that, so that's its own thing. But for me, assuming that, you know, that was an option, it ultimately wasn't, having a baby wasn't a path that I chose. And part of it was just choosing the deep knowing of how devoted I was to my work and feeling like I would be happier touching more people with the shamanic work that I do, and that my disposition is really suited to it. So as someone who's quite introverted, having someone interacting with me, you know, didn't seem like the greatest thing. But here I am in Death Valley, and the guide said, "Katie, honey, you're holding open the two destiny paths of baby, not baby, because you don't want to grieve the fact that you'll never hold your child in your arms. And we'd like you to grieve that. We'd like you to grieve that and close it. If you change your mind later, you can choose again. Like if you meet somebody and you're suddenly like, you know what, baby is the thing, cool. You can move destiny paths around fast. That's part of the work that you do. But right now it's really getting in the way of where your destiny path could go because you're holding this whole other pathway open, and you're only doing it because you don't want to really feel what you're feeling. So we'd like you to get present with that and, you know, look at closing this for now because you really at this moment don't have any intent to go down it. You just don't want to give it up." And it was a really powerful and potent message. And I could really see that. I could really find that I didn't want to grieve the path not taken, and avoiding grief, as I mentioned, shadow emotion, was messing with the fullness of the availability of my magic. I was using my magic in a way that wasn't optimal. And I've done that with my magic. I've had some strong messages from the guides about you're using your magic to stabilize a not very stable environment. So one of the things that some people know about me is I rented a little granny flat. The main house was overhead and they'd put a little apartment in downstairs. And it was a beautiful apartment in the middle of a mesa, gorgeous views of the hills, tucked into the side, pretty courtyard. I could have my hot tub under the stars, very private and protected, nice place to ward. All of that was really great. I stayed there for like 10 years. The downside was that the gal had a boyfriend who was on meth, who became increasingly unstable, abusive to her, never harmful to me, but like this force of chaos. You know, he'd get really, really manic and really stirred up. And I told myself the story that I couldn't afford to live somewhere else because naturally, since, you know, deal with unpredictable boyfriend and the police coming to arrest him and all of that was in there. She had not raised my rent, so I was way below market rate. And I was still really figuring out how to be solvent. But instead of using my magic and my resourcefulness to, you know, just keep looking around, put it out, hey, I need another place to live. So I did it over time. Ultimately, the situation just crumbled and I ended up moving really, really fast because of the violence crossing a certain threshold. Again, not toward me, but I needed to be out of there urgently. And it was really expensive to do it that way, financially, emotionally, psychologically. Lo and behold, once I was moved out, I started making a lot more money when I wasn't dealing with that in the background. But the point being that I was stabilizing something and making it work. And I want to be clear, I wasn't like miserable while I was there. It was just that it was so much better to not be there. And I think that not allowing for change or endings or the uncertainty of the future has us not choosing again when something just really isn't optimal. San Diego's a huge place. There were a lot of places that I could have been, and I have no doubt that if I hadn't been just adding rose quartz and obsidian and strengthening wards, but had been looking for something else, it would have been a more graceful path. 2020 hindsight, I'm not like beating myself up, but it's just a place that really reveals how much we can use our magic to sustain something. And then I didn't really get that kind of ending I was describing with my friend, where I said goodbye to this 10-year relationship where I was living on the property with this woman. It was more like, I'm so sorry your life sucks so much and you're not available to change it, and I so feel for you and I gotta go. There was just a really different, like, my friend is saying goodbye to her neighbors who are moving on to other places. They're sharing stories about what they're doing next. And so there's a really enormous beauty to being able to have these endings and have these completions and to do them well. And most of all, it's going to free up your power and your magic and get you in an aligned environment that doesn't leak energy. And it might not be the most fun to go through the grief and to go through the feelings of loss, because if you've participated with something for a long time, even if there was bad stuff or misaligned stuff or stuff you're complete with, there was good stuff too. So allowing the grief to move through, having the skill of dealing with grief, and being able to sit with being with an ending, even if it's not a fun chapter in the same way that something else is. I feel like we love the movement onward to new things and new projects and new beginnings and new possibilities. And there's great energy in that. And the sort of yin stillness of allowing that something has had meaning to you and it's run its course is really powerful medicine as well. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. Also, a special thank you to my patrons for your support. You offer me the time freedom to work on passion projects like this one. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.